In the darkest corners of the wilderness, something stirs. Witnesses have encountered creatures that defy explanation. Huge figures lurking just beyond the trees, leaving behind strange, unearthly signs. From eerie footprints to heart-stopping face-to-face encounters, these stories will make you question what really roams the forests. Join us as we uncover chilling tales of survival, mystery, and terror, where the line between myth and reality disappears. Are you brave enough to listen? Darren Caldwell had been a cave explorer for over a decade, each expedition pushing him deeper into the unseen recesses of the earth. At 32, with a record of successfully navigating even the most treacherous cave systems, he was known for his meticulous planning and unrivaled calm under pressure. The expedition to Hawks Hollow Cave had seemed like another routine venture, one that would add another notch to his belt. But he had no idea that he was about to step into a nightmare. The day had started like any other, with Darren gearing up in his small camp just outside the cave entrance. Hawks Hollow was famous for its labyrinthine tunnels and subterranean chambers, the type of place that drew in explorers seeking new paths. Darren had been down this trail before, but today there was an unsettling feeling in the air, a quiet hum beneath the usual sounds of rustling leaves and distant birds. He pushed it aside as nerves from the previous week's storms, but couldn't ignore the sense that something was different. The cave's entrance yawned before him, a dark mouth that seemed to swallow the light as he descended into the tunnels. With his headlamp casting faint beams of light, he navigated the narrow corridors, his boots echoing softly on the wet stone floor. He paused briefly at a small underground stream to refill his water bottles, then continued onward, deeper into the cave system. As he made his way through a particularly tight passage, Darren noticed something odd. Scratches along the cave walls, unnaturally deep gouges. They weren't from rockfalls or erosion. Something had caused them. He could feel his heart rate increase, but Darren quickly dismissed the thought. There were larger creatures living in caves, bats, and other wildlife, but he had never seen anything that could leave marks like these. The air grew thicker as he ventured deeper. The further he moved, the colder it became. A tremor of unease crept up his spine, but Darren tried to shake it off. After all, this was his domain, and he was used to the darkness. Still, there was something about the atmosphere that felt off. He reached a wide, open cavern that he had marked on his map, a spot known for its striking stalagmites and impressive underground lake. It was here, in this eerie stillness, that he first heard it. A low growl, vibrating through the stone beneath his feet. His breath hitched in his chest, and every instinct screamed at him to turn back. But curiosity pulled him forward, and Darren pressed on, convinced that whatever it was, it had to be another animal, maybe a bear or a wild cat, something that had wandered in from the surrounding forest above. He stopped when he heard the growl again, closer now, almost as if it were right beside him. The sound was unnerving, unlike any animal he had encountered. It was primal, deep, and sent a wave of dread through him. Suddenly, the ground beneath his boots shifted. He glanced down just in time to see uneven footprints in the dirt, larger than any humans or animals. He froze, his heart thudding loudly in his chest. The footprints were too wide, too deep, impossibly large. A shadow moved at the edge of his light, and then there it was. A creature like nothing he'd ever seen emerged from the dark corner of the cave, moving silently despite its size. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, and its eyes gleamed with an eerie yellow hue in the dim light. It stood at least 10 feet tall, towering over Darren, its hands clenched and unclenched, the claws glinting in the weak light, sharp enough to tear through rock. Darren's breath caught in his throat as he stumbled backward, his legs weak with fear. His mind raced, trying to process what he was seeing. This wasn't any animal he had ever heard of. The creature's face was monstrous, its features a blend of ape-like and human-like qualities. Its eyes locked onto his, and a sickening chill ran down his spine. The growl came again, louder this time, vibrating through the very stone around him. The creature moved closer, its body dwarfing Darren. His survival instincts kicked in, and he turned to run, his boots slipping on the damp floor. But before he could make it more than a few feet, something heavy slammed into his side. The impact sent him sprawling to the ground, gasping for air. His head collided with the cave floor with a sickening thud, disorienting him. Darren's vision blurred as he struggled to rise. The creature was on him now, its monstrous form looming above, casting a long shadow. The ground vibrated with every step it took, the air thick with its scent. Wet fur, earth, and something worse. Something deeply primal. His heart pounded in his ears as the creature leaned down, bringing its face dangerously close. It let out a low, rumbling growl, then raised one of its hands, claws extended. Darren's body refused to move. His limbs were numb, his thoughts a jumble. He could only stare at the creature as it stood over him. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the creature turned and melted back into the darkness, its heavy footsteps echoing as it retreated. Darren's mind struggled to grasp what had just happened, but his body refused to respond. The shock of the encounter was too much. His vision began to fade, darkness closing in on the edges of his sight. Darren tried to push himself up, but could only manage to collapse back onto the cold stone. His mind was swirling, thoughts of the creature, of the terror he had felt, clouding everything. And then, as his vision blurred further, he passed out, the sound of his own heartbeat thudding in his ears. When he awoke, hours later, he was back at the cave entrance, somehow having managed to drag himself out of the depths. His body ached, his head spun, but his mind was crystal clear. He had survived, but at what cost? The authorities, when they arrived, believed it was a bear attack. There were no signs of a Sasquatch, they claimed, but the damage to Darren's psyche was undeniable. Locals, however, whispered of a creature that had lived in those caves for centuries, a creature known to few, feared by many, a Sasquatch. They could see the terror in Darren's eyes when he spoke of his experience, though he couldn't bring himself to fully share what he had encountered in that dark, forgotten corner of Hawk's Hollow Cave. The truth, whatever it was, remained buried in the shadows. Tom Harris had always been a man of the woods. As a seasoned forest ranger, his life revolved around the vast, untouched stretches of land that made up the remote sections of Green Grove National Park. At 45, Tom had seen his fair share of strange events, weather anomalies, wildlife skirmishes, and the occasional lost hiker. But nothing could have prepared him for what he would encounter on his final day in the woods. Tom was alone on a routine patrol in the park's northwestern corner, a dense stretch of forest rarely visited by anyone. It was an area known for its silence, the kind that weighed heavily on the senses. The trees were tall and close-knit, their thick branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dim, flickering patches. Tom had always loved the solitude of the area. It was his escape, his place of peace. But that day, as the shadows grew longer and the air grew colder, something felt wrong. He had been searching for signs of illegal logging when he came across something unsettling. A trail of broken branches trampled underfoot led him deeper into the forest. The strange thing was that there was no human presence. No signs of hikers, no footprints, just the broken vegetation. He followed the trail with caution, his hand resting on the radio at his side. It was his habit to check in regularly, but on this day, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. The further Tom moved into the forest, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. It was as if the forest itself had grown heavier, more oppressive. The sounds of the woods, birds, rustling leaves, faded into an unnatural stillness. Only the sound of his boots crunching through the undergrowth filled the air. It was then that he heard it. A low growl, so faint it almost sounded like a distant wind. But Tom knew better. It wasn't the wind. It was something alive. Something that shouldn't be there. He paused, his hand gripping the radio tightly. But still, he didn't speak into it. His instincts told him to stay quiet, to listen, to learn what it was that had made the sound. But then a snap, louder than anything before, rang out from behind him. He spun around, his heart racing in his chest. His flashlight beam danced frantically over the trees, illuminating nothing but dark shadows. A moment later, the growl returned, louder, closer, and this time, unmistakable. Tom's blood ran cold as the noise rumbled through the ground beneath him. It was no animal he had ever heard before, certainly not a bear or mountain lion. It was full of raw aggression. Tom's pulse quickened as his mind raced through the possibilities. What could it be? A large predator? A bear, maybe? He took a step backward, his instincts screaming at him to get away, but his feet were frozen. And then, he saw it. Through the darkness, two yellow eyes gleamed from the underbrush, barely visible in the dim light of the forest. The creature, whatever it was watching him, waiting. In that moment, a sense of dread gripped him. It wasn't just a predator. It was something different, something ancient. Tom couldn't explain why, but the presence of the creature made him feel insignificant, like an intruder in a world he didn't belong to. The growl rose again, more menacing. The creature stepped into the faint light, its silhouette towering over the trees. At first, Tom couldn't process what he was seeing. The figure before him was too large, too imposing. Its body was covered in thick fur, its arms and legs corded with muscle. It stood easily 8 to 10 feet tall, its broad chest heaving with each breath. But what chilled him the most were its eyes, yellow, almost luminous, full of intelligence and malice. And as it stepped closer, its face came into view. It was a grotesque fusion of man and beast, with a broad, flat nose, a heavy brow, and sharp, exposed teeth. Tom's hand finally reached for the radio, but before he could press the button, the creature lunged. He barely had time to react as the figure closed the distance between them in an instant. Tom's heart nearly stopped as he was knocked backward, his chest slamming into the ground. The creature's hands, enormous and powerful, grabbed him by the shoulders, lifting him effortlessly off the ground as if he were a child. He kicked and struggled, trying to break free, but its grip was unyielding. The creature held him for a long moment, its heavy breathing filling the air. Tom's mind was spinning. He had never encountered anything like this before. The creature didn't seem to want to kill him, at least not immediately. It just held him, examining him like a piece of prey. Tom could feel his strength leaving him, his chest tightening with each passing second. The creature's grip was crushing, each breath more difficult to take. And then, just as quickly as it had attacked, the creature dropped him to the ground. Tom gasped for air, his body trembling in the dirt. His mind raced, but his body refused to obey. He had no strength left to run, to fight, to do anything. He couldn't move. He could only watch and wait. The creature didn't leave immediately. It hovered nearby, watching him, its yellow eyes fixed on his every move. And then, it turned and disappeared back into the forest, as silently as it had come. Tom lay there for what felt like an eternity, his mind unable to comprehend what had just happened. When he finally regained enough strength to stand, he stumbled back to his truck, his body bruised and broken. He reported the incident to his supervisor, but when the authorities arrived, they found no sign of the creature, no tracks, nothing that could explain Tom's ordeal. They claimed it was a bear attack. The claw marks on his arms, the bruises, they said, were consistent with a large animal. They dismissed any idea of a Sasquatch, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. But the locals, those who knew the forest better than anyone, whispered differently. They had heard the stories, seen the tracks, and knew the truth. Tom didn't say it, but he knew they suspected it too. He had encountered something that could not be explained. Something far older, far more dangerous than any animal. Megan and Ethan had been hiking for hours, navigating the steep, muddy trail that led deeper into the Bluegrass Range. The mountain range, known for its treacherous cliffs and unpredictable weather, was not the easiest place for beginners, but they had come prepared. They were both experienced hikers, albeit not experts, and had been dreaming of this trip for months. Their goal was to make it to the summit of Bearclaw Peak, but as they made their way through the dense forest, a sudden storm descended upon them, turning the peaceful hike into a frantic scramble for shelter. The wind whipped through the trees, and the sky darkened as thick clouds rolled in, blocking the sunlight and casting the forest into an eerie twilight. They moved quickly, searching for a place to wait out the storm, but the weather was relentless. The trail, slick with rain, seemed to stretch endlessly, and with every step, the sound of thunder grew louder. Megan's heart pounded as she glanced nervously at the darkening sky. They needed to find shelter, fast. A break in the trees revealed a small cliffside, a rocky outcrop that would offer them some cover from the storm. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Megan and Ethan hurried to the edge where the cliff jutted out over a steep drop. They set up their tent quickly, their hands trembling from the cold and the stress of the situation. Once inside, they huddled together, trying to calm their racing hearts. The rain lashed against the fabric of the tent, and the wind howled through the trees, but they were safe for the moment. Still, something felt off. The silence between the gusts of wind seemed unnaturally thick, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Megan peered out of the tent flap, squinting against the driving rain. At first, she saw nothing but the swirling mist and the rain-soaked trees. But then, her gaze shifted to the edge of the cliff. A shadow moved at the far end, large and indistinct against the backdrop of the storm. Her breath caught in her throat. It was too big to be a bear. Before she could say anything, a sudden deafening roar shattered the silence, a sound that vibrated through the very ground beneath them. Megan and Ethan both froze, their eyes wide with terror. The roar came again, closer this time, a deep, guttural growl that was unlike anything they had ever heard. It sent a chill down their bones, and for a moment, neither of them could move. Then, the figure appeared. A hulking creature emerged from the trees, moving with surprising speed for its size. its broad shoulders hunched. Its fur was matted and wet from the storm. The creature's eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, a sickly yellow that gleamed with malevolent intent. Megan could see its powerful legs moving quickly, its arms swinging as it bounded toward something or someone just ahead of it. The creature was chasing something. Through the rain and the mist, they could barely make out the smaller figure that it was pursuing, but Megan could tell it was a large animal, a deer, perhaps, or a wild boar. The creature's feet pounded against the earth, each step making the ground tremble as it closed the distance between itself and its prey. Megan's heart raced as she watched in stunned silence. The chase was unfolding right in front of them, a brutal, primal display of speed and power. The smaller animal, its movements desperate and erratic, darted for cover. But the creature was relentless, its every move calculated and precise. The deer, or whatever it was no match for the beast's raw strength. Megan and Ethan exchanged a look of horror, their breath shallow and fast. There was nothing they could do, nowhere to run, nothing to protect themselves from the creature's wrath. It was all happening too quickly. In an instant, the creature reached its prey. With a horrifying, almost surgical motion, it grabbed the smaller animal by the neck, lifting it off the ground as though it weighed nothing. The chase was over, but the creature did not stop. Instead, it turned toward the cliffside, its eyes locking onto Megan and Ethan's tent. The two hikers froze, their bodies stiff with fear, as the creature's gaze seemed to pierce through them. For a moment, everything was still. The storm raged around them, but the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, without warning, the creature let out another terrifying roar, its enormous arms swinging in wild abandon. It turned away from the cliff's edge, disappearing back into the forest with its kill. Megan and Ethan stood frozen, unable to speak. Their minds raced, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Was it a bear? A mountain lion? No, this was something else. Something much larger, much more terrifying. They had seen it with their own eyes. The sheer size, the unnatural speed, the raw power. It wasn't just an animal. It was something else entirely. Something ancient. As the storm continued to rage around them, Megan finally found her voice, telling Ethan they needed to go. Her words were barely a whisper, but they were enough to break the silence. Ethan nodded, his face pale and drawn. They had no idea where to go, no idea how to escape. But they knew one thing for certain. Whatever it was that had just passed by them, it wasn't finished. They couldn't stay here, not with that thing still out there, somewhere in the darkness. The two hikers gathered what little gear they could and stumbled out of the tent, hearts pounding, trying to make their way back down the cliffside. The rain continued to pour, and the wind howled around them, but they barely noticed. Their minds were consumed by the image of the creature, its eyes, its roar, its predatory speed. Hours later, when they finally reached the safety of the ranger station, they were both trembling, drenched to the bone, but alive. They tried to tell their story, but the rangers brushed it off as an overactive imagination. A bear, maybe. A wolf, even. But both Megan and Ethan knew the truth. The forest had a secret, one they would never forget, and whatever it wasn't done. David Mitchell had always been a thrill seeker. At 17, he was used to exploring the wilderness around his hometown in northern Oregon. The winding roads that cut through the mountains were familiar to him, and the small forest trails were a perfect place to ride his dirt bike, feeling the rush of wind and freedom. On this day, David had gone alone. He had been out there for hours, riding up a long, winding road that led to a remote section of the forest, a place few dared to venture. The road was barely wide enough for a car, crumbling at the edges and overgrown with thick trees that shaded the path. It was late afternoon, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. David loved the solitude, the way the forest seemed to absorb everything around him. He could feel the quiet settle over him as he rode, the hum of his bike, the only sound in the stillness. He had been on the trail for more than 2 hours when he saw something strange. He was riding along the cliffside, a narrow stretch of road where the trees grew dense and the drop-off was steep. That's when he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. At first, it was just a shadow, fleeting and distant. But then, as he rounded a bend, it became clearer. A large figure stood in the trees, partly hidden by the undergrowth, but unmistakable. The creature was enormous, at least 8 to 10 feet tall, its body covered in matted dark brown fur. It stood motionless, as though watching him. David's heart skipped a beat, and instinctively, his hand tightened on the throttle, speeding him forward. His first thought was that it was a bear, but there was something wrong with that idea. The creature was too large, too human in shape. Its arms hung low, and it had a broad, bulky chest. This was no bear. David sped down the road, his mind racing. Should he stop? Should he turn back? The creature hadn't moved, but he didn't want to risk finding out what it was capable of. He pushed forward, trying to shake off the unease growing in his chest. But just as he thought he had passed the danger, he heard it, a loud crash of branches snapping from behind him. His heart pounded in his ears as he glanced over his shoulder. The creature was moving. It was faster than David expected, its long strides covering ground in seconds. Panic flooded his chest as the creature closed the distance. David pushed his bike harder, accelerating as fast as he could, the roar of the engine filling the air. He glanced back again, and this time, the creature was almost on top of him. Its face was a hideous mix of man and ape, with deep-set eyes glowing with an eerie yellow tint. Its mouth was agape, revealing sharp teeth as it roared, its voice booming through the trees. David's breath came in short, ragged bursts as he tried to outrun it, but the creature was relentless. The bike roared, but it wasn't fast enough. The creature was gaining. Just ahead, the road veered sharply to the left, a dangerous curve that he knew could be his only chance to escape. He leaned into the turn, the tires skidding on the loose gravel as he pushed through the bend. But when he glanced back over his shoulder, the creature was right there. It reached out with one long arm, swinging like a battering ram. In a split second, the force of the impact sent David flying off his bike. He hit the ground hard, his body skidding across the gravel and dirt. Pain shot through him, and his vision blurred. He struggled to get up, but the world spun around him. His head throbbed, and the taste of blood filled his mouth. But before he could make sense of what had happened, the creature was on him. David tried to scramble to his feet, but the beast's hand shot down, grabbing him by the leg. Its grip was like iron, and with terrifying strength, it yanked him off the ground. His body was flung through the air as though he weighed nothing, crashing against the rocks that lined the road. The creature's breath was hot and fetid as it loomed over him, its massive body blocking out the sky. David's heart hammered in his chest, every instinct telling him to fight back, to escape, but he couldn't get his legs to move. The creature snarled, its yellow eyes never leaving him. For a moment, David thought it would end there, that he would be ripped apart. But then, just as suddenly as it had attacked, the creature stepped back. It paused for a long moment, as if considering its next move. David's body was frozen with terror, every fiber of his being screaming at him to get up, to run, but he couldn't. His body was numb from the impact, and the pain was overwhelming. The creature's gaze shifted, as though something had caught its attention. And then, without a sound, it turned and vanished into the trees, leaving David lying in the dirt, battered and broken. The pain was almost unbearable, but David managed to drag himself to his feet, stumbling toward the bike. Blood trickled down his face, and his limbs were weak. But somehow, he was still alive. He knew he couldn't stay there. He had to get out. With great effort, he climbed onto the bike and started the engine. His hands shook as he gripped the handlebars, but he forced himself to move, pushing forward, even as the world seemed to spin around him. By the time he reached the nearest town, nearly an hour later, David was barely conscious, his vision blurry. He managed to stagger into the sheriff's office, blood soaked through his clothes, his face pale and covered in cuts. He collapsed onto the floor before he could speak, his words tumbling out in a frantic, incoherent mess. The sheriff and deputies quickly called for medical assistance, but when they investigated the area, there was no sign of the creature, no tracks, no trace of what David had seen. The authorities chalked it up to an animal attack, perhaps a bear or something else. No one believed David's story. David didn't care what anyone believed. He had seen it with his own eyes, and he would never forget the fear that gripped him when it had chased him down that mountain road. Eli Barton was a quiet man, the kind who left the city behind without telling many people. After years of working in tech, he'd traded screens for silence, choosing to hike solo into Washington's backcountry with nothing but a journal, a small pack, and a craving for peace. He knew the trails well and planned to be out only 3 days. When he came back, he was missing time, and he was no longer the same. The rangers found him near the edge of a gravel forest road, barefoot, dazed, and shivering under the midday sun. His gear was gone. His palms were torn up, knees scraped raw. He barely spoke at first, eyes sunken like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't seem dehydrated or injured beyond surface wounds, but something was off, like he wasn't fully there. When they finally coaxed out his story, it didn't come out in order. He kept going back to the fog. He said it started the second night. He'd been near a ridge overlooking a ravine when the weather shifted. Mist rolled in, thicker than anything he'd ever seen. His GPS glitched, the compass spun. At first he thought he'd wandered off trail, but then he found boot prints, his own, circling back on themselves. He said the forest didn't feel right anymore. Trees were in places they shouldn't be. Familiar paths no longer led where they should. That's when he started hearing the breathing. At first, he thought it was a deer, or maybe a bear. Deep exhales just beyond the fog, steady, deliberate. But no animal followed him the way this did. No creature matched his pace through hours of hiking, always behind trees, always just out of sight. Sometimes it would stop, like it was waiting. Other times, it would move fast, crashing through thick brush without ever showing itself. He said he tried to climb high to get above the fog, to reorient himself. That's when he noticed the silence. No birds, no wind, just that breathing. He didn't sleep that night. Something walked around his camp. No fire, just a tarp and cold ground. He lay still, clutching his knife, heart pounding until the stars faded. Then he saw it, not clearly, but enough. A silhouette, towering, wide-shouldered, hair or moss dripping from long arms. It didn't move like a bear or a man. It stood still, just beyond the trees, until the fog swallowed it. He never heard it leave. That's when he ran. He lost the trail almost immediately. He remembers falling more than once. His journal was lost. He said the woods turned on him. Roots grabbed his feet. Branches clawed at his face. Sometimes the breathing came from ahead, sometimes from behind. Once, he heard something that sounded like speech, but not in a language he knew. Guttural, repetitive, like it was trying to communicate or mock him. He said on the third day, the fog lifted, but only for a moment. That's when he saw it again. This time, full view, just across a narrow stream, 8 to 10 feet tall, crouched low. Its eyes were small but burning. It stared at him, lips curled back as it sniffed the air. Then it stood, unfolding itself into a shape that didn't make sense. Limbs too long, shoulders hunched like an ape, but legs that bent wrong. He didn't run. He couldn't. His legs wouldn't move. He said it turned and walked away, disappearing into the woods without a sound. That's the last thing he remembers. The search team had been looking for him for 2 days. They never found his gear or his original campsite. Nothing in his pack was recovered. No tracks matched his story. The area had seen fog, but not enough to explain being lost for days. There were no signs of animal predation, no injuries consistent with the attack. But Eli kept drawing the same thing in the hospital. Tall, hunched figures in the trees, eyes like dying embers. The official explanation was exposure, minor dehydration, and temporary dissociation due to isolation. Authorities said he likely got turned around in the fog and suffered a mental breakdown after being lost. They never mentioned the shape he described or the massive prints he claimed to have seen in the mud. Rangers closed part of the trail for maintenance but quietly reopened it 2 weeks later. Some hikers online, after hearing his story through local news, mentioned they'd experienced strange things in that same area. Missing time, malfunctioning gear, odd smells like wet fur and copper. One said their dog refused to enter that section of the trail again. Eli never hiked again. He moved back to the city, took a studio apartment in downtown Seattle, and didn't speak to the press. He refused interviews. Friends said he kept the windows covered and always walked home before dark. He never claimed it was Bigfoot. He never gave it a name. He just said the forest had watched him, and something had followed him out. Jacob Lawson had been a ranger in the Plantwood Mountains for over a decade. The solitude of the job didn't bother him. In fact, he had grown to love it. His days were spent patrolling the dense forests, ensuring the safety of hikers, checking trails, and keeping an eye on wildlife. But lately, something had felt off. For the past week, he'd noticed strange signs in the woods: disrupted brush, broken branches, and odd tracks in the soft earth. At first, he had thought it was just the usual wildlife, perhaps a bear or a moose wandering through. But the tracks were different. They were too large, and the shape didn't match anything he had seen before. On this particular morning, as he made his way along a seldom-used trail, Jacob found something that made his blood run cold. Footprints, far larger than any bear or mountain lion. They were deep, almost as if the creature that made them weighed several hundred pounds. The tracks were spaced too far apart, suggesting something large was moving through the area, and as Jacob followed them deeper into the forest, an unsettling silence settled around him. The usual sounds of the forest: The rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, had all disappeared. All he could hear was the faint crunch of his boots on the forest floor. As he moved forward, he noticed something else. Broken trees, as though something had moved through them with incredible force. The size of the disturbance didn't make sense. A bear could knock over smaller trees, but these were large, sturdy oaks and pines. Something was out there, and it was big. Jacob stopped, his instincts kicking in. He had worked in the forest long enough to know when something wasn't right. He scanned the area around him, but all he could see were the thick trees and the distant mountains, looming in the background. The tracks led off the trail, down a steep embankment to a thick patch of underbrush. As he knelt to inspect them further, a sudden movement caught his eye, a shadow in the trees. His heart raced, and his breath caught in his throat. He wasn't alone. The shadow moved quickly, darting from one tree to another. It was too fast to be a man, too fluid to be an animal. It moved with an unsettling grace, as if it knew exactly where to go, blending into the shadows. Jacob stood slowly, his hand instinctively reaching for the radio at his belt. But when he glanced down, he saw that the device was missing. He'd left it back at his truck. A rush of panic surged through him, but he quickly pushed it down. He was alone in the wilderness, and the last thing he wanted was to draw attention to himself. The creature, whatever it was watching him. Jacob could feel its presence, something primal and menacing, lurking just out of sight. He continued down the trail, following the tracks as they led him farther into the woods. Each step felt heavier, as though the air itself was thickening, pressing in on him. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves made him flinch. The silence was suffocating. The tracks led to a small clearing. In the center of it stood a large, fallen tree, its trunk split down the middle. Jacob hesitated for a moment, staring at the tree, when he heard a low growl, distant but unmistakable. His blood froze. That wasn't a bear. Suddenly, something moved behind him, and before he could react, a creature emerged from the shadows. It was huge. Its muscular body was covered in fur, like an animal's, but its eyes, which glinted in the fading light, had the intelligence of a human. The creature stood motionless, watching him with a strange, almost calculating expression. Jacob's heart hammered in his chest as he took a step back. The creature's eyes followed his every movement, its head tilting slightly as though studying him. He had seen enough in his career to know that this was no bear, no mountain lion, nothing he had ever encountered before. The creature grunted low, a sound that resonated deep in his chest. Jacob's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. He couldn't tear his eyes away. The creature stepped forward, its heavy footfalls making the ground tremble slightly. Jacob's breath quickened, and for a brief moment, he thought it might charge at him. But instead, it paused, looking him over one last time before turning and disappearing into the trees, as silently as it had appeared. Jacob stood frozen for a long moment, his mind racing. He had no idea what he had just seen, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't something he could explain. By the time he made it back to the ranger station, he didn't speak a word to anyone. There were no reports filed, no official word from him. The tracks, the broken trees, and the creature in the woods, none of it was recorded. But every time Jacob stepped into the forest from that day on, the feeling of being watched never left him.